You ever hear about a story so impossible it sounds like Hollywood fiction? A tale where every single fact, every verified detail, every official military record says one thing, and logic says the opposite? Well, this one's going to test everything you think you know about survival, about luck, and about what a single human being can endure when death is a mathematical certainty. Picture a man sitting on a bulldozer, no armor around him, no steel walls protecting his body, just open air, a roaring diesel engine, and the entire might of Hitler's Atlantic Wall pouring fire directly at his position. German gunners had been training for this moment for months. They had calculated the angles, zeroed their weapons, and created what military strategists called perfect fields of fire. Every inch of that beach was designed to be a graveyard. And there, in the middle of it all, sat Private Vinton Dove, a 24-year-old construction worker from Virginia who'd joined the Army less than a year earlier. His mission was simple on paper: push 8 feet of rocky shingle aside and fill a 9-foot anti-tank ditch so American tanks could roll off the beach. His survival rate, according to Army engineers who planned the operation, hovered below 20%. His commanding officer told him the job would kill him. He wasn't being dramatic. He was being honest. The date was June 6, 1944. The place was a stretch of sand the Allies codenamed Omaha Beach. And for the next 3 hours and 26 minutes, Vinton Dove would sit exposed on that bulldozer, while German machine gunners fired over 20,000 rounds directly at his position. Engineers who analyzed the battle afterward ran the numbers multiple times. The statistical probability of survival was G-3%. Both Dove and his partner should have been eliminated within the first 20 minutes. They weren't. Somehow, impossibly, bullet after bullet missed, and by the time the guns finally fell silent, Dove had carved open the most important exit route off the bloodiest beach of the entire Normandy invasion. If you're learning something new about World War II, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. There's a lot more where this came from. Now let's rewind the clock and understand exactly how a construction worker from Virginia ended up at the center of the largest amphibious invasion in human history. Vinton Walsh Dove didn't grow up dreaming of war. Born in 1920, he came of age during the Great Depression, watching his family scrape by like millions of other Americans. By the time he reached his 20s, he'd found steady work in construction, learned to operate heavy machinery, and married a woman he loved. Life was simple. Work hard, come home, plan for the future. Then Pearl Harbor happened, and everything changed. In September 1943, Dove entered the Army at Fort Myer, Virginia. He was 23 years old, physically fit, and already knew how to handle equipment that most recruits had never seen. The Army noticed. Instead of handing him a rifle and shipping him to basic infantry training, they sent him to bulldozer operator school. It was technical work, specialized work, the kind of job that required patience and precision. Dove excelled at it. Within months, he received assignment to Company C of the 37th Engineer Combat Battalion, a unit whose very name would soon become synonymous with impossible courage under fire. The 37th Engineer Combat Battalion had a history stretching back to the First World War, but by 1943 it had been reorganized and redesignated as an amphibious engineering unit. That word, amphibious, meant everything. While regular infantry trained to fight on solid ground, the 37th prepared for the nightmare scenario: storming beaches defended by concrete bunkers, machine gun nests, artillery positions, and millions of mines. Their job wasn't just to fight. It was to literally build roads through chaos, to transform killing grounds into passable terrain, to turn certain death into mere danger. They were attached to the 5th Engineer Special Brigade, one of the units specifically created for Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Nazi-occupied France. Training consumed the next several months. Dove and his fellow engineers practiced beach landings in England, running simulated assaults again and again, until every man knew his role by instinct. They studied aerial photographs of the French coastline, memorizing the positions of obstacles, noting where the Germans had placed their heaviest defenses. Intelligence reports painted a grim picture. The Normandy beaches weren't just defended, they were fortified with an obsessive attention to detail that bordered on paranoid. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, had personally overseen the strengthening of the Atlantic Wall, transforming miles of coastline into an interconnected web of death. Steel obstacles jutted from the sand at low tide, each one capable of ripping the bottom out of a landing craft. Concrete bunkers housed machine guns with interlocking fields of fire, meaning that even if attackers suppressed one position, another would cut them down from a different angle. Anti-tank ditches blocked every natural exit from the beaches, deep trenches that vehicles couldn't cross without engineer support. And overlooking all of it, on the bluffs above the sand, sat artillery positions that could drop shells anywhere on the beach with pinpoint accuracy. Omaha Beach was the worst of the 5 invasion beaches. Allied planners knew it. The terrain offered almost no cover. The bluffs rose 30 meters above the sand, giving German defenders a perfect view of everything below. Only 5 narrow draws, natural gaps in the bluffs, provided exits from the beach, and each one was defended by a reinforced strong point. The Germans designated these defensive positions wider stands nests, resistance nests, and numbered them carefully: WN62, WN64, WN65, WN66. Each one was a fortress in miniature, packed with machine guns, mortars, and riflemen who had spent months rehearsing exactly how they would slaughter anyone foolish enough to land on the sand below. Exit E1, located in the Rouquet Valley, was one of the most critical draws on the entire beach. If the Americans could open E1, they could funnel tanks, trucks, and reinforcements off the killing ground and into the French countryside beyond. If they couldn't open it, the invasion would stall on the sand, and thousands of men would die, waiting for a path that never materialized. Defending E1 was Waiter Stand's Nest 65, a concrete casemate position on the western shoulder of the draw, equipped with machine guns that commanded perfect visibility over the approach below. The German soldiers inside had zeroed their weapons on the most likely landing zones. They had practiced their firing drills until muscle memory took over, and they had absolutely no intention of letting a single American vehicle pass. June 5, 1944. The men of the 37th Engineer Combat Battalion boarded their transport ships in English ports, most of them believing they were headed for another training exercise. The weather was terrible, high winds, choppy seas, the kind of conditions that made amphibious operations suicidal. General Eisenhower himself had nearly postponed the invasion, but meteorologists promised a brief window of calmer weather on the 6th. It would have to be enough. As the fleet crossed the English Channel that night, many soldiers were too seasick to do anything but grip the rails and pray. Down in the holds, crammed together with hundreds of other men, the engineers tried to sleep knowing what the morning would bring. Dove likely checked his equipment one last time, the small gear he'd carry onto the beach, the knowledge that his real tool, his bulldozer, would be waiting for him on a separate landing craft. At 5:30 hours on June 6th, the first wave hit Omaha Beach. It was a catastrophe. The carefully planned landing dissolved into chaos within minutes. Strong currents pushed landing craft hundreds of yards off their assigned positions. Boats that should have landed at Dog Green ended up at Easy Red. Units that should have attacked as cohesive companies came ashore scattered across miles of beach, mixed with men from completely different regiments. And the Germans were waiting. The naval bombardment that was supposed to suppress the defenses had largely missed its targets. The heavy bombers that were supposed to crater the bluffs had dropped their payloads too far inland, afraid of hitting the approaching fleet. When American soldiers splashed into the waist-deep water, they stepped into a killing field that the defenders had spent months perfecting. Machine gun fire tore through the advancing infantry from multiple angles. Mortar shells exploded among the packed landing craft, sending shrapnel scything through exposed bodies. Men weighted down by 60 pounds of equipment, drowned in water, barely 4 feet deep, pulled under by the weight of their own gear. Those who made it to the sand found no cover, only a gradual slope of beach that offered no protection from the bullets snapping overhead. Within the first 30 minutes, entire companies ceased to exist as fighting units. Officers and sergeants fell faster than privates, targeted by German snipers who knew that eliminating leadership would paralyze the attack. By 0700, the situation was so desperate that General Omar Bradley, watching from his command ship offshore, considered abandoning Omaha Beach entirely and redirecting the remaining troops to Utah or the British sectors. The engineers suffered worst of all. Their job required them to work in the open, exposed and vulnerable, placing explosive charges on the beach obstacles while bullets and shrapnel filled the air around them. The Gap assault teams, Joint Army and Navy demolition units, had trained for months to blast lanes through the German obstacles within the first 30 minutes of the landing. Instead, they found themselves fighting for survival before they could even unpack their explosives. One team had just finished laying charges on a row of steel hedgehogs when mortar fire struck their position. The premature detonation killed or wounded 19 engineers in a single blast. Another team was dragging their rubber boat full of explosives off the landing craft when artillery hit. Only one man survived. By the time the rising tide forced the surviving engineers back, they had cleared only 6 partial gaps through the obstacles. They had suffered casualties exceeding 40%. The DD tanks, specially designed Sherman tanks equipped with flotation screens that allowed them to swim ashore, were supposed to provide armored support for the infantry and engineers. At Omaha, they drowned. The rough seas swamped most of the 741st Tank Battalion's vehicles before they ever reached the beach. Of the 32 DD tanks launched into the water, only 2 made it to shore under their own power. 3 more were landed directly from their transport ship after the crew realized the conditions were too rough. The rest sank, taking their crews with them. Without tank support, the infantry had nothing to suppress the German bunkers, nothing to draw fire away from the exposed engineers trying to clear the obstacles. By 0800, the beach was a nightmare. Bodies floated in the surf. Burning vehicles sent columns of black smoke into the gray morning sky. Wounded men screamed for medics who were themselves wounded or dead. And yet slowly, impossibly, small groups of Americans began to fight their way off the sand. Scattered bands of survivors, often led by junior officers or sergeants who simply refused to die in place, began working their way up the bluffs through gaps in the wire and minefields. These weren't coordinated attacks. They were desperate acts of survival that happened to carry the men inland. At one point, Brigadier General Norman Cota, the Assistant Division Commander of the 29th Infantry Division, walked upright through the fire on Dog White Beach, rallying men with the now legendary words, "Rangers, lead the way." It was insanity. It was also working. Private Vinton Dove's landing craft ground onto the sand at 0830 hours, 2 hours after the first wave had hit, 2 hours of waiting offshore while the battle raged, 2 hours of watching the smoke rise and hearing the distant thunder of explosions. His bulldozer was loaded on a separate craft, a flat-bottomed vehicle designed to deliver heavy equipment directly onto the beach. When the ramp dropped, Dove drove his machine into hell. The bulldozer was a standard Caterpillar D7, fitted with armor plates over the engine and cab, protection that might stop rifle rounds but would do nothing against machine gun fire at close range. It was painted olive drab, anonymous, just another piece of military equipment among thousands. But to the German gunners watching from WN-65, it was the most important target on the beach. They understood what the Americans were trying to do. If the bulldozers could clear the shingle, the bank of smooth, round stones that blocked vehicle movement, and fill the anti-tank ditch, American armor would pour through the gap and into the draw beyond. The defense of E1 would collapse. The beach would be lost. Every machine gun in the strong point swiveled toward the approaching bulldozer. Dove wasn't alone on the machine. Private William J. Shoemaker served as his relief operator. The two men would alternate between driving the bulldozer and guiding it on foot, one resting while the other worked. It was standard procedure for sustained engineering operations, a recognition that no single man could operate heavy equipment for hours without relief. But standard procedure assumed normal conditions. What they faced was anything but normal. As Dove pushed the bulldozer toward the shingle bank, the first bullets began snapping past his position. Then more. Then the sound became continuous, a roaring hiss of lead that seemed to come from every direction at once. The Germans had calculated their fields of fire with mathematical precision. Every weapon in WN-65 could engage targets on the approaches to E1. Machine guns with interlocking beaten zones meant that even if one gunner missed, another would hit. Mortars dropped shells in pre-planned patterns, walking explosions across the most likely work areas. And all of it was concentrated on the bulldozer, sitting exposed in the open. Dove had no cover. The armor around the engine might protect the machine's mechanical heart, but his body was exposed from the waist up. He was sitting on a slow-moving target, while some of the best-trained gunners in the German army tried to kill him. The work was agonizingly slow. Pushing shingle with a bulldozer isn't like pushing dirt. The stones roll and shift, resisting the blade, requiring multiple passes to move even a few feet of material. Dove worked the controls methodically, dropping the blade, pushing forward, raising it, backing up, repeating the process while bullets sparked off the armor and whined past his head. Shoemaker moved alongside the machine, guiding Dove through the worst of the debris, watching for mines, ducking behind the blade when the fire became too intense. The noise was indescribable, the roar of the diesel engine, the continuous crack of incoming fire, the deeper boom of mortar rounds, the screams of wounded men nearby. Minutes passed, then an hour. Dove and Shoemaker kept working. The bulldozer crept forward meter by agonizing meter, carving a path through the stones that blocked the exit. German gunners adjusted their aim, walked tracers across the blade, tried to hit the operators in the brief moments when they were exposed. And somehow, impossibly, they kept missing. The statistical reality of their survival made no sense. Over 20,000 rounds would eventually be fired at that position during the landing. Perfect fields of fire, perfect visibility. Two men sitting on an exposed vehicle for over 3 hours. The probability of survival was calculated at 0.03%, essentially zero. Yet neither man took a fatal hit. Around them, other engineers from the 37th Battalion worked to support the breakthrough. Men from Company B arrived with additional equipment, their bulldozers joining the effort to fill the anti-tank ditch. A company from the 149th Engineer Combat Battalion, which had landed near E1 by mistake, swept off course by the same currents that had scattered the infantry, threw their weight into the operation. The ditch was 9 feet deep, a massive obstacle that would stop any tank cold. Filling it required moving thousands of cubic yards of material under constant fire. Men died doing it. The 37th Battalion's commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Lionel F. Smith, was killed on the beach that morning, one of 24 men from the unit who would never leave Omaha alive. Yet the work continued. Dove finished clearing the shingle and moved to the anti-tank ditch, pushing rubble and debris into the gap while mortar rounds exploded around him. Shoemaker took over when Dove's hands cramped from gripping the controls. Then Dove climbed back on when Shoemaker needed rest. The rotation kept both men functional, kept the bulldozer moving, kept the exit slowly taking shape. By late morning, a rough path existed, not smooth, not easy, but passable for tracked vehicles. American tanks began threading their way through the gap, their guns finally able to engage the German positions at close range. The fall of WN-65 came around 11:30 hours. Tank fire hammered the concrete casement, smashing embrasures and silencing machine guns. Infantry worked around the flanks, attacking from directions the German defenders hadn't anticipated. The last resistance crumbled, and suddenly exit E1 was open. Not partially open, not contested, genuinely clear for vehicle traffic. Engineers cut a road up the western side of the draw, and within hours, E1 became the main route off Omaha Beach. The congestion that had trapped thousands of men on the sand finally began to ease. The invasion had a foothold. Vinton Dove and William Shoemaker climbed off their bulldozer sometime that afternoon, exhausted beyond anything they'd ever experienced, covered in dust and sweat and the grime of battle. Neither man had suffered a serious wound during the main assault, a fact that defied every statistical model the Army could construct. They had operated an exposed vehicle under direct enemy fire for over 3 hours. They had been targeted by an entire strong point's worth of weaponry. And they had survived through some combination of skill, luck, and what German after-action reports would later describe with a single word: inexplicable. The battle for Omaha Beach cost approximately 4,700 American casualties, killed, wounded, and missing, making it by far the bloodiest of the 5 D-Day landing sites. The German 352nd Infantry Division, whose presence on the beach had been a nasty surprise for Allied intelligence, suffered around 1,200 casualties defending the position. Among the American units, the engineers paid a terrible price. The 37th Engineer Combat Battalion recorded 82 casualties on D-Day alone, more than a quarter of the unit's strength. The 146th Engineer Combat Battalion lost 112 men. The Gap assault teams, those joint Army-Navy demolition units, suffered the highest casualty rates of any specialized force in the invasion. The Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest award for valor in the United States Army, was presented to both Private Vinton Dove and Private William Shoemaker for their actions on June 6, 1944. The citation praised their extraordinary heroism in clearing the road through the shingle and filling the anti-tank ditch while under intense enemy fire, noting that German gunners had specifically singled out their bulldozer as a prime target. It was a recognition that what they had accomplished went beyond ordinary courage, beyond mere bravery, into a realm that the military's formal language struggled to capture. The 37th Engineer Combat Battalion remained on Omaha Beach for 3 more days after D-Day, continuing the grueling work of clearing obstacles, expanding the exits, and building roads from the sand to the plateau beyond. The men worked around the clock, knowing that every hour of delay meant more lives lost, more troops trapped on the narrow beachhead. Dove stayed with his unit throughout, refusing evacuation despite the strain of what he'd endured. It wasn't heroism in the dramatic sense. It was simply doing the job, showing up each day to push more stone and fill more holes, while the invasion force flowed past him into France. The war didn't end for Vinton Dove on the beaches of Normandy. The 37th Battalion moved inland, following the Allied advance across France, through Belgium into the Netherlands, and finally into Germany itself. The work changed: bridge building, road repair, mine clearance, but the danger remained. On February 9, 1945, near a town called Prüm in Germany, another mortar attack found Dove. Shrapnel struck his back, lodging 3 small fragments near his spine. He survived, carrying the metal inside him for the rest of his life, a permanent reminder of what he'd endured. The battalion entered Germany in March 1945 and remained until November, when the surviving men finally shipped home to a country that was only beginning to understand what they'd accomplished. the physics of Vinton Dove's survival, have puzzled historians and military analysts for decades. The German strongpoint defending E1 had clear sight lines to his position. The machine gunners were experienced soldiers who had trained specifically for this scenario. Over 20,000 rounds were expended during the landing, not all at Dove's bulldozer, certainly, but a substantial portion directed at the vehicle that represented the greatest threat to the defense. German after-action reports confirmed what American observers had seen. The gunners targeted the bulldozer, walked rounds across the blade, tried every technique they knew to eliminate the men operating it. And yet, for over 3 hours, nothing connected with lethal effect. Several theories have been proposed. The armor plating around the engine may have deflected more rounds than anyone expected, creating a partial shield that protected the operators during critical moments. The movement of the bulldozer, slow as it was, may have complicated the gunner's aim, making a stationary target assumption invalid. The smoke and chaos of the beach may have obscured visibility at critical moments, causing shots that should have hit to miss by inches. And there's always the possibility that sheer random chance aligned in ways that no statistical model could predict. In the end, no single explanation suffices. The survival of Vinton Dove and William Shoemaker remains one of those small mysteries that cluster around every great battle. Events that shouldn't have happened but did, defying the mathematics of death. What can be said with certainty is that their survival mattered. Exit E1 was the first usable route off Omaha Beach. It became the main artery for the American advance on D-Day, carrying tanks, trucks, and thousands of reinforcements from the sand to the high ground beyond. Without that exit, the men trapped on the beach would have remained trapped longer, suffering additional casualties, while engineers struggled to open alternative routes. The entire timeline of the invasion would have shifted, perhaps by hours, perhaps by days. In the calculus of war, the actions of 2 bulldozer operators contributed to saving hundreds, possibly thousands, of lives that would otherwise have been lost in the chaos of a stalled beachhead. Vinton Dove returned to Virginia after the war, carrying his Distinguished Service Cross and the shrapnel in his back. He went back to construction work, back to the life he'd known before Pearl Harbor interrupted everything. He married, raised a family, and lived the quiet existence of a man who had done extraordinary things and didn't feel the need to talk about them constantly. For most of his neighbors, he was just Vinton, a steady guy who showed up to work on time and treated people fairly. The story of Omaha Beach belonged to the history books, not to everyday conversation. Years later, Dove's son, Vinton G. Dove, would donate his father's military jacket and Distinguished Service Cross to the U.S. Army Engineer School Museum. The artifacts joined a collection dedicated to preserving the memory of what Army engineers accomplished in every American conflict, from the Revolutionary War to the present day. The jacket itself was unremarkable, standard olive drab, the same style worn by millions of soldiers during World War II. But pinned to its chest was a bronze cross hanging from a blue ribbon, the physical representation of a moment when one man refused to let fear dictate his actions. The broader story of Army engineers on D-Day deserves more attention than it typically receives. While infantry and armor rightfully dominate most accounts of the landing, the engineers made the advance possible. They blasted the gaps through beach obstacles that allowed landing craft to reach the sand. They cleared the minefields that would have turned the bluffs into death traps. They built the roads that transformed a contested beachhead into a functioning logistics hub, and they died in staggering numbers doing it, casualties exceeding those of many infantry units precisely because their work required them to be exposed during the most dangerous hours of the assault. The 1st Engineer Special Brigade alone suffered over 40% casualties during the initial clearance operations. The machinery they used became as important as the weapons wielded by frontline troops. The armored bulldozers, both the standard Caterpillar models and the more versatile Sherman tank dozers, proved essential for clearing routes through debris and filling anti-tank ditches. Of the 105 Sherman tank dozers available for D-Day, only 16 were allocated to Omaha and Utah beaches, and of those, only 6 made it ashore at Omaha, 5 of which were quickly destroyed by German fire. The single surviving tank dozer, combined with the armored bulldozers like the one Dove operated, provided the engineer teams with their only heavy equipment capable of moving obstacles under fire. Without them, the work would have been done by hand, meter by agonizing meter, under the same murderous fire that had already killed so many. The German defenders of Omaha Beach fought with a professionalism and determination that even their enemies acknowledged. The 352nd Infantry Division had only recently deployed to the Normandy coast, but its soldiers were well trained and motivated. They believed they were defending the European continent from invasion, protecting their families and homeland from the advancing Allies. Their positions had been constructed by the organization taught, the Nazi engineering corps that built the Atlantic Wall, using concrete, steel, and millions of hours of forced labor. The bunkers were designed to withstand naval bombardment, and they largely succeeded. Most of the shells and bombs that struck Omaha Beach hit nothing of military value, leaving the defensive positions intact. It's worth pausing to consider what the battle looked like from behind those concrete walls. The German machine gunners in WN-65 watched wave after wave of American soldiers hit the beach, watched them fall in the surf and on the sand, watched those who survived try to crawl toward whatever cover existed. They fired until their barrels overheated, swapped weapons, and fired again. They saw the bulldozer appear and understood immediately what it meant. If that machine succeeded, the defense would fail. So they tried to stop it. For over 3 hours, they tried to eliminate the 2 men operating that bulldozer, the 2 men who represented the difference between holding the beach and losing it. And in the end, despite every advantage of position and firepower, they failed. Why did they fail? The honest answer is that no one knows for certain. War is chaos, and within that chaos, improbable events happen constantly. The bullet that should have struck a fatal blow passes an inch to the left. The mortar round that should have landed directly on position falls 5 yards short. The soldier who should have died in the first minute somehow lives through the first hour, then the second, then the third. Military historians can analyze these moments endlessly, constructing theories and running simulations, but the fundamental unpredictability of combat resists neat explanation. Vinton Dove survived because he did, and that circular logic is sometimes the most honest assessment available. What we can analyze is his behavior during the crisis, the choices he made, the risks he accepted, the discipline he maintained while chaos exploded around him. The Army had trained him to operate a bulldozer, and that's exactly what he did. He didn't abandon his machine. He didn't seek cover. He didn't freeze under fire. He pushed the blade down, moved the stones, backed up, and repeated the process while thousands of rounds sought his life. That kind of focus under extreme stress doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from training, from repetition, from building muscle memory so deeply that the body performs even when the conscious mind wants nothing more than to run and hide. It also comes from something harder to define, a quality that military thinkers have tried to capture with words like courage, resolution, and moral fiber. Dove didn't want to die on Omaha Beach. Nobody wanted to die there. But he wanted something else more, to complete the mission, to open the exit, to give the men trapped on the sand a chance to survive. That want, that determination, carried him through 3 hours that should have been fatal. It allowed him to function when function should have been impossible. And in functioning, he helped turn a potential catastrophe into a costly but successful landing. The legacy of D-Day extends far beyond individual acts of heroism, of course. June 6, 1944, marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany in Western Europe. The beachhead established that day would grow into a massive logistical operation, pouring millions of soldiers and millions of tons of equipment into France over the following months. The liberation of Paris came in August. The crossing of the Rhine followed in March 1945, and on May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally, ending the war in Europe. None of that was inevitable on the morning of June 6th. The invasion could have failed. If the German defenses had held just a few hours longer at Omaha Beach, the entire landing might have unraveled. Bradley's consideration of abandoning the beach wasn't paranoia. It was a reasonable assessment of a situation that had deteriorated far beyond anyone's expectations. The Americans held on because thousands of individual soldiers, sailors, and engineers made the decision to keep fighting despite impossible odds. Some of them died, some of them survived. All of them contributed to a collective achievement that changed the course of history. The men who served in the 37th Engineer Combat Battalion returned to their lives after the war, most of them leaving the Army and re-entering civilian society. They had seen things that would stay with them forever: the bodies floating in the surf, the burning vehicles, the screaming wounded, the sudden silences where friends had been moments before. They processed these memories in different ways. Some talked about their experiences, many did not. The culture of the 1940s and 1950s didn't encourage men to discuss emotional trauma, and most veterans simply set their war experiences aside, focusing on building families and careers in a country that desperately wanted to return to normalcy. The battalion itself was inactivated in December 1945, its wartime mission complete. It would be reactivated years later as an airborne engineer unit attached to the 82nd Airborne Division, carrying forward the traditions and honors earned on Omaha Beach. The Presidential Unit Citation and French Croix de Guerre with Palm that the battalion received for its D-Day performance remained on its colors, permanent recognition of what those men accomplished under fire. For Vinton Dove, the decades after the war brought the ordinary rhythms of American life: work, family, community, the gradual transition from young veteran to middle-aged professional to elderly statesman. The Distinguished Service Cross sat in a drawer or on a shelf, a physical reminder of June 6, 1944, but not a topic of constant conversation. When people asked about the war, he might tell a story or two. When they didn't ask, he didn't volunteer. It was a generation's response to collective trauma: acknowledge it happened, honor those who didn't come home, and move forward with the business of living. The story of Omaha Beach has been told countless times in books, films, documentaries, and academic studies. Steven Spielberg's Saving Private Ryan brought the terror of the landing to millions of viewers who had never imagined what those first minutes on the beach were like. Historians like Stephen Ambrose and Joseph Balkowski reconstructed the battle in meticulous detail, interviewing survivors and combing through archives to understand exactly what happened and why. Military analysts studied the German defensive preparations and the Allied planning process, drawing lessons that would influence amphibious doctrine for decades. And through all of it, the individual stories of men like Vinton Dove added texture to the larger narrative, specific examples of courage that made the abstract statistics concrete. 20,000 rounds, 3 hours and 26 minutes, a 0.3% chance of survival. These numbers define the impossible reality that Vinton Dove faced on the morning of D-Day. They don't explain how he survived. They simply describe the parameters within which his survival occurred. And perhaps that's the most important point. History isn't made by averages and probabilities. It's made by specific individuals in specific moments, making specific choices that the mathematics of the situation say shouldn't work. Dove chose to stay on that bulldozer. He chose to keep working the controls. He chose to trust his training and his partner, and whatever force, luck, providence, chaos, was keeping the bullets from finding their mark. And because he made those choices, Exit E1 opened, and the invasion had a chance. The physical location where all this happened is quiet now. Omaha Beach is a memorial site, visited by thousands of tourists each year who walk the sand and climb the bluffs and try to imagine what June 6, 1944, looked like. The German bunkers still stand, some of them preserved as historical monuments, others slowly crumbling as time and weather erode the concrete. The American cemetery at Colville-sur-Mer overlooks the beach, row upon row of white crosses and stars of David marking the graves of men who didn't make it off the sand. Among them rest members of the 37th Engineer Combat Battalion, including Lieutenant Colonel Smith, who led his men into the most dangerous landing zone of the war and paid the ultimate price. The lessons of D-Day continue to resonate in military planning and doctrine. Modern amphibious operations account for the failures and successes of Normandy, building in redundancies for situations where heavy equipment is lost before it reaches shore. Engineer units train for contested beach landings, understanding that their work is as essential to success as any infantry assault. And the principle that Dove's actions demonstrated, that technical proficiency and moral courage can accomplish feats that statistical models deem impossible, remains at the heart of how military organizations think about training their personnel. For those of us who weren't there, who can only imagine what those hours on the beach felt like, the story of Vinton Dove offers something valuable. It reminds us that ordinary people, placed in extraordinary circumstances, can accomplish extraordinary things. Dove wasn't a superhero. He wasn't specially selected for heroic destiny. He was a construction worker who learned to drive a bulldozer and ended up at the center of the largest seaborne invasion in history. And when the moment came, when every calculation said he should die, he kept doing his job until the job was done. That's the legacy that matters. Not the medal, not the statistical improbability, not even the strategic significance of Exit E1. The legacy is the example, a man who faced death for over 3 hours and chose to work rather than flee. The legacy is the proof that courage isn't the absence of fear but the decision to act despite it. The legacy is the knowledge that when the world demands the impossible, sometimes the impossible happens, not through miracles, but through human beings who refuse to accept the mathematics of despair. Vinton Walsh Dove, Private First Class, Company C, 37th Engineer Combat Battalion, recipient of the Distinguished Service Cross, survivor of 20,000 bullets, builder of the road off Omaha Beach. One of the countless men who made June 6, 1944 possible, and one of the few whose specific contribution can be traced through the chaos to its concrete result. The exit he opened is still there, a path through the bluffs that tourists walk today without thinking about the blood that watered the sand beneath their feet. But the path exists because a man on a bulldozer refused to stop working, and that's a truth worth remembering. The English Channel is calm most summer days now, a peaceful stretch of water between England and France that ferries tourists and cargo without any hint of the violence it witnessed 8 decades ago. The beaches are clean, the bunkers are silent, and the only sounds are seabirds and waves. But history lives in those places, embedded in the stone and sand, waiting for anyone who takes the time to listen. And when you stand on Omaha Beach, looking up at the bluffs where the German guns once pointed down, you can almost hear it, the roar of diesel engines, the crack of rifle fire, the thunder of naval shells, and somewhere in the middle of it all, a bulldozer pushing forward inch by bloody inch, carving a road through hell because someone had to do it, and Vinton Dove decided that someone would be him.